Horror is one of the greatest genres of film. It's a staple of pop culture and has had a very large impact on modern society and how we appreciate scary things. Without good horror films, life would be very, very boring, and we wouldn't be able to celebrate all of our beloved franchises and characters, no matter how badass or hilariously cheesy they may come off. I love horror films, and chances are if you clicked on this video, you probably do too. Now, where we may differentiate in beliefs is when I say that horror games are the definition of pure garbage. There's never been an actual good horror game in all of human history so far. This may seem like a hot take or whatever you like to call it, but allow me to explain myself and just take a moment to consider it yourself. My name is Cain Keltic, and as I go through my reasons for not liking horror games, I'll start adding my own personal rules and what have you to make a feeling of cohesion and an overall smooth flow throughout this video. To begin, let's discuss some of the most iconic horror games first. When I think of truly iconic horror games and franchises, the first two I think of would be the Resident Evil series and the Silent Hill series. Seeing that these two are some of the oldest horror game franchises in gaming history and are still ongoing, I thought that it would be appropriate to mention them first and allow me to get them out of the way immediately. Starting with Resident Evil, I must first admit that I am a huge fan of the series and have played pretty much all of the mainline entries, or at least a remake of them, besides 1 and 0. And I've played a few of the spin-offs, but not all of them. I really like this series, and honestly I may even love it, but that does not change my belief that the Resident Evil games are good horror games. This brings me to my first rule for this video. Is it actually a horror game? Now, I know most people would argue that Resident Evil is definitely a horror series and primarily revolves around being scary, but I would definitely argue that most and nearly all the Resident Evil games aren't that scary and revolve much more around survival, action, and replayability over horror 9 out of 10 times. Resident Evil is much more about managing a finite amount of resources and replaying the game for a better score rather than being scary. I'm not saying that I don't find Resident Evil scary at all because I'm too tough for it or anything. I just don't think there's many scary parts and moments to Resident Evil past the first two games in my opinion, as it heavily relies more on creepy and unsettling vibes rather than scary. The series is still fun and I've loved all the games I've played, but I'm going to argue that they're not horror games. For Silent Hill, it's ironically like the opposite of my argument for Resident Evil. Unlike Resident Evil, where I've played most of those games, or at least enough of them, I don't believe I've played a single mainline Silent Hill game in my life, or at the very least I don't remember playing any of them. The funny thing is, although I've never played any of the games before, they definitely look like actual horror games and are praised both by critics and fans alike, and it's led to a plethora of sequels and movies, and very recently, an announcement of a remake for Silent Hill 2, which is considered the objectively best game in the series. Although I've played none of the games and know very little about them, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt that some of the games are probably good horror games. And to those watching who may argue that Silent Hill is just a ripoff of Resident Evil, I won't blindly defend Silent Hill, as the developers themselves have said that the series was made due to the success of Resident Evil, but the Silent Hill series is clearly its own idea, and all of them heavily revolve around one horror theme, being psychological, which also happens to be my favorite horror subgenre, but that's beside the point. Also, Silent Hill seemed to have more consistent horror compared to Resident Evil, as they're all very similar in horror aesthetic, which cannot be said with Resident Evil, as we see with the transition of Resident Evil Part 1 to Part 4, Part 4 to Part 6, and Part 6 to Village/Part 8. Now I've stopped defending a game I've never played, as I just wanted to make it clear I won't dislike a horror game if I've never played it before. This leads me to rule 2. Is it a horror game I've played or want to play? This includes, but is not limited to, Alien Isolation. I know that this game is beloved and universally praised for its impressive AI and consistent tone to that of the original 1979 film, but I've never played it. It looks interesting and anxiety-inducing, but if I had to make a hypothetical argument for not considering it a good horror game, it would have to be the fact that it relies too much on a pre-existing IP, and the fact that most of the fear that the player will get will have already been established by an original piece of media, and not by the game itself, which really lowers the status it can have as a good horror game with its own identity. Now, to be clear, I don't agree with this. It's just a hypothetical for this argument, following these rules as I'd like to give the game an actual try sometime. Rule 2 also includes Dead Space. People love this series and claim that it's one of the greatest horror series of all time, or at least the first 2 games were. Now, I've never played the games, but I have to admit that I love sci-fi horror and body horror. My hypothetical argument here is that Dead Space seems to lean more into survival and replayability like Resident Evil, just has horror as its aesthetic but not overall genre, and apparently that can be heavily applied to Dead Space 3, but still I've never played these games, so feel free to prove me wrong until I eventually play them. Now, I know there are probably more iconic horror games that I haven't played, and I agree that's true, but I feel like the other games I'm going to talk about will follow Rule 2, the other rules as well, as I discuss them. So don't worry if your favorite horror game hasn't been mentioned yet. Now for our next part, I want to discuss the world of online horror games. First, let me be clear. I don't mean a horror game that has some online mode or some online elements that don't heavily affect the game. I'm talking about exclusively or predominantly online only games that are focused primarily on playing a horror game with other people. The main example you and I are definitely thinking of would have to be Dead by Daylight. Now my third rule is not actually banning online games, as it is totally possible for a good horror game to be online only. Where I believe online horror games fail, however, is when it comes to consistency. Dead by Daylight, for example, is not consistent. The game started off as pure horror for a few years until it divulged far more into the competitive and toxic scene, making the game much more about balance and gameplay over genuine horror. This is not me saying I dislike Dead by Daylight, because I unfortunately do like the game, and it's one of my most played games of all time. But I've definitely given up calling it a horror game for sure. It also follows Rule 1 as well, as it's now more horror adjacent than actual horror, relying on a pre-existing IP over actual scariness. Speaking of pre-existing IPs again, let's talk about another popular online horror game, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Unlike Dead by Daylight, Texas Chainsaw has a very serious and queer horror tone, and is genuinely trying to be a scary game you can play with your friends. I think the horror in it has potential to work, but it fails in consistency. The game eventually became like Dead by Daylight, in which I mean that the game is too focused on balance and meta, but this time it's not the fault of the developers, but instead the fault of the player base. Whether this was a good decision, I'll leave up to you, but it's no longer focused on being scary, and instead just about both teams trying to win as efficiently as possible. There are a lot of other games like Texas Chainsaw that I can think of, like the Evil Dead game, the new Killer Clown game, and some other obscure ones like the Predator game, but they all have the same issue about losing their scariness value, so they can just have higher replayability and a longer player base. These games are clearly love letters to the horror genre, but they're not really horror themselves. The one real exception to this, in my opinion, was the Friday the 13th game, because it was honestly the scariest and most horror online game I've ever played. The only issue about it, in my opinion, was the fact that it was shut down and stopped being worked on, due to things out of the developer's control. I really loved this game, but unfortunately things happen, and although this won't be an official rule, a good horror game has to be one that we can still actually play. The official third rule, however, is that the game must be consistently horror. Now the next games we'll talk about also have a pretty bad problem with consistency, but that is the least of their troubles. I am, of course, talking about indie horror games. Now, I'm very aware that indie games are definitely a broad term and can mean just about anything. Obviously, I don't think every horror game made by an individual or small team is an inherently bad horror game, and it definitely doesn't mean only a AAA team can make a good horror game, because I think they're much less likely to make a good horror game. To explain my fourth rule, I'd like to discuss the biggest indie horror game of all time, being Five Nights at Freddy's. Now we all know FNAF is iconic and a staple of modern horror, whether I like it or not. I'm pretty young and hip, so of course I grew up with the series, and I still like most of the games in the series, or at least everything before Pizzeria Simulator. I think the first game was very creative and had a unique aesthetic and dynamic gameplay that relied slightly on strategy and heavily on luck. I think this is actually great game design for horror, because I think the player should have control over what's happening in the game to make it interactive and engaging, but there should be an element of randomness and unpredictability so the player never knows what will happen to an extent. If I clearly like FNAF, or at least some of the games, then you may be wondering why I don't consider them good horror games. This leads me to Rule 4. Is there passion put into it? Now this may outrage some people in my audience, because clearly Scott Cawthon has put a lot of passion into the series and dedicated a good chunk of his life into making these games as great as they can possibly be. Now my argument to that claim is no. Yes, I think Scott is a good game developer, and he does love the franchise, or at the very least likes it. The issue is that at the end of the day, these games were just made to make a quick buck. FNAF 1, for example, was made out of passion and pure spite at the reception for Scott's previous game, but I don't think Scott was really interested in making a good horror game. Rather, he just wanted to make a creepy one-off game and make a couple bucks off of it. All the other games past 3 were honestly just made to sell Funko Pops and merchandise for kids, because kids love horror games far more than anyone else, because most modern horror games are targeted to them, so they'll buy said merchandise. It's a perpetual cycle, you could say, and honestly I'm sick of these games. Specifically games like FNAF, Bendy, Hello Neighbor, Poppy's Playtime, Garden of Banban, and all these other forgetful titles that were solely made to make money, and specifically the money of kids. I don't think this is just a problem with horror games, as it extends to horror films too, with their countless reboots and remakes, but it's honestly just the problem with modern media as a whole nowadays. I think a good horror game has to have a lot of passion in it and a true intention of making a good horror game, instead of a successful horror game. Using cheap jump scares, marketable characters, microtransactions, and confusing lore for game theory is not real passion. I would say that I have no ill will towards the studios that make these games, but that would be a lie, as they're practically scamming these kids and ruining the industry. Alright, well that got a little heated at the end, but let's get a palate cleanser to end this video. My final rule for this video is rule number 5. Is it my opinion? And I don't mean me specifically, I mean to whoever follows these rules or have their own rules. I think we should all be allowed to have our own tastes and differences, and I encourage that, as if we all agreed on what is good or bad, then it would ruin the fun of enjoying things in the first place. To encourage this rule to be used, allow me to talk about some horror games I like real quick. That may not follow every rule, but at the very least it is my opinion. The first game I thought of was a weird choice, but it's Baldi's Basic, as I feel like the game is very unique and just a bizarre amalgamation of so many things, but it feels fresh and enjoyable, and the developer is clearly putting a lot of time and effort into the remake/sequel, and I can tell that the passion and horror is still there, even if it leans more into dark comedy than pure horror. The next game I'll mention is Little Nightmares, as it's a pretty cool and visually amazing series, with an awesome art style and interesting universe, and overall a pretty impressive series. My only issue with the games are the fact that I couldn't get into the gameplay. I felt like there wasn't much gameplay at all, but some people may prefer that, and I can honestly say I would love to watch a Little Nightmares movie or animated series instead personally. The last game I'll mention is PT, because although I've never played it and won't be able to, I can honestly say that it's a very impressive and interesting project with such a limited and small scale. I think the storytelling it uses is fun and the ending is iconic, and I would have 100% bought Silent Hills because of it if it wasn't cancelled. Now, with that out of the way, I conclude this video. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I had writing it and expressing my feelings. Don't take this video to heart at all if you disagreed with any of my opinions. Although most of what I said was true and I agree with, I was slightly exaggerating and simply trying to make a point, rather than trying to tear down the horror game industry as a whole. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you liked the video, feel free to subscribe as I plan on making more videos like these, but if you don't want to, I completely understand. This was Cain Keltic, and I hope you have a marvelous day, and may we see each other next time.